Hey, here we are. I have on a previous episode made the statement that Stoicism and Zen are like philosophical cousins, family almost. Little different personalities, but they look alike. They resemble each other. I might even throw Taoism in that mix as well. Well, I will finally get an official ruling today on whether that's a fair analogy or not. Maybe not. That's okay if I'm wrong. I'm happy to learn either way. Either way, the ref here calls it. And let me tell you about the referee. It is a Super Bowl caliber referee. Dr. Massimo Pigliucci holds a doctorate in genetics, a PhD in biology, another PhD in philosophy of science. He is a professor of philosophy at City College of New York. He is a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science. He's the author of 16 books, including Answers for Aristotle, How Science and Philosophy Can Lead Us to a More Meaningful Life. He's got a new one coming out. We'll talk about that in a little while as well. His 2015 essay for the New York Times, which is entitled How to Be a Stoic, is one of the most shared articles of the New York Times. Professor Pigliucci is credited as being one of the driving forces of Stoicism's resurgence in the United States in the early 21st century. He's that big. His accolades are actually too lengthy to include in the time allotted here. He joins me now from New York. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome Dr. Massimo Pigliucci to the program. Thank you for your time, Professor.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to dive right in, but I may have many listeners who aren't really familiar with Stoicism. Can you give us a cursory gist of the philosophy, perhaps highlighting the role of virtue ethics and the dichotomy of control? Tell people what that is exactly.
So Stoicism is a Greco-Roman Hellenistic philosophy. And actually, interestingly, I often present it as the Western equivalent or response to Buddhism. So there definitely are similarities there, although there are major differences, as we might get into that, because they're interested. Both the similarities and the differences are interesting. It is, as you say, a type of virtue ethics, which means that it is a Socratic philosophy. It was directly inspired by Socrates. And it essentially, Stoics essentially believe that virtue, which they defined as excellence in moral character, is the only good, only true good in life. There are other things that we may want, such as, health, wealth, education, money, love, and all that sort of stuff. The Stoics refer to those as preferred indifference, meaning that they're preferred, other things being equal, but they are morally indifferent because being wealthy, let's say, or healthy or educated, it doesn't make you a good person or a bad person. It's entirely irrelevant to your moral status. And the only thing that really matters for the Stoics is whether you work on your character, essentially. So that's the basic idea. Now, you mentioned the dichotomy of control. The dichotomy of control is one of the fundamental notions of Stoicism. And it basically says that in everything you do in life, you can look at any task or any project or anything that you're approaching to do, and you can divide, you can break it down into individual bits and components, and these bits and components will fall into two broad categories. The ones that are up to you, meaning where you have agency, where you can actually make a difference, and the ones that are not up to you, where you don't have agency or your agency is very limited. And the basic Stoic idea is that the wise thing to do is to focus only on the bits where you can make a difference, only where you have a certain degree of control, and simultaneously develop an attitude of acceptance and equanimity toward the things that you don't control. Now, this particular notion, which modern Stoics refer to as the dichotomy of control, is actually found in a number of other traditions. It's found in 8th century Buddhism, in 11th century Judaism, and even in 20th century Christianity. A lot of people have heard through what is called the Serenity Prayer, which is this prayer that is often said at the beginning of meetings of 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous. And basically, the Serenity Prayer asks God to give me the wisdom to tell the difference between what I can change and what I cannot change, the courage to change what I can, and the serenity to accept what I cannot. Well, essentially, that's a dichotomy of control. And in fact, one can argue that Buddhists developed the notion independently from the Western tradition, very likely. While on the other hand, Christians got it straight from the Stoics, because there was a lot of influence of Stoicism on early Christianity. And so actually a lot of the Stoic concepts, once you start explaining them a little bit, sound familiar to a Western audience, because they say, wait a minute, I've heard that something like that before. Yeah, yes,
Right.
you have, because the two traditions have interacted for a long time.
It's embedded in the culture. Yeah, this I came up with my own sort of list of similarities and the key differences I saw it. And correct me where I'm wrong, or praise me where I'm right. The we'll take them one by one. The similarities I saw between Buddhism and I am coming more from a Zen tradition. I sort of bring up that nuance because Zen takes its own path away from more traditional Tibetan or Theravada Buddhism.
Right.
But
yeah, I was going to say before we get to actually look at individual differences and similarities, part of the difficulty of doing that is that while broadly speaking, you can talk about Stoicism as a one coherent philosophy because it evolved over a period of 5 centuries in ancient Greece and Rome, but then it kind of died until the 20th century, right? It was resurrected in the 20th century. I mean, as I said, it influenced Christianity, it influenced early modern philosophy in the West, but as a tradition, it kind of stopped evolving, by the 2nd century, let's say. Well, on the other hand, as you know, Buddhism kept evolving continuously for the last 2.5 millennia. So it probably would be fair to talk about Buddhisms in the plural
sure,
these days, not in the singular. So it's a good thing you're specifying a particular tradition, because otherwise, one immediately say, "Well, I see that's different." Well, but that's not true in this particular tradition.
right. I mean, they have actually even split apart almost as much as Catholicism and Protestantism in some ways.
Right.
But some of the basics, I guess, of Stoicism and most Buddhist traditions, one would be suffering. Namely that it comes from the mind. And I'm not talking about pain, not like physical pain here, but Seneca says a man is as unhappy as he has convinced himself he is, and Buddhists tend to eliminate, or at least aim to eliminate suffering by detaching themselves from desires, whereas a Stoic eliminates suffering by being indifferent to external. Well, you talked about the dichotomy of control, like what you can't control. I guess you train yourself to be somewhat indifferent to those things beyond your control. I guess you could argue that for the most part, that's kind of a game of semantics. That, I mean, aren't you saying the same thing? You're in essence detaching yourself from things beyond your control. Is that how you would describe?
Yeah, you're saying, I think you're right. I think you can say, if not exactly the same thing, certainly a very similar thing, certainly in the general ballpark. The Stoics think that the problem is what they call unhealthy emotions. The modern stereotype of a Stoic is somebody who goes around with a stiff upper lip and suppressing emotions, a la Mr. Spock from Star Trek. And with all due respect to Mr. Spock, one of my favorite characters ever, that's not what it is. What it is that the way it works for Stoics is that they make a distinction between what they call healthy emotions and unhealthy emotions. And in fact, they say that we should try to stay away as much as possible from the unhealthy emotions, and by contrast, mindfully, actively cultivate the healthy emotions. So the unhealthy emotions are defined as any emotion that gets in the way of sound reasoning. So anything that undermines your ability to reason correctly about things is an unhealthy emotion. Typical examples are anger, fear, and hatred. Healthy emotions, by contrast, are those emotions that are, as the Stoics say, in agreement with reason, or in agreement with nature, because they think that the nature of a human being is to be a reasonable human being, a reasoning human being. And so to say that something is in agreement with reason, it's the same as to saying that it's in agreement with nature. Examples of healthy emotions are joy for the proper kinds of things, love in the proper contexts. For instance, you can think of joy that you experience in helping others. That's a healthy emotion. the love that you have for your long-term partner or for your children or for your friends, those are healthy emotions. And so the idea is not to suppress the emotions, is rather to kind of shift your emotional spectrum away from the unhealthy stuff and toward mindful embracing of the healthy stuff. Now, the suffering that you're talking about comes in because we are, on the other hand, normally we tend to fall prey to the unhealthy emotions. We get angry, we hate things or people, we are afraid of things that we shouldn't be afraid of, and that sort of stuff. And all of those emotions basically generate a disturbance of the mind. Your mind is in turmoil. You cannot be serene. You cannot be, reacting properly to situations. So in a sense, your suffering does come from the way you think about the world, not from the world itself. Epictetus, who was a late first century, early second century Stoic philosopher, says that the problem is, whatever problem you're experiencing is not in the thing itself, it's in how you think about the thing.
Right. Yeah. I preach that message too, sort of when I talk about Zen things. You brought up a good point that I want to segue to something, and then I'll come back to the similarities and contrasts. I have a good friend that he considers himself a practicing Stoic, and so I asked him. I mentioned I would be interviewing you, and that I said, well, what questions would you have for Professor Massimo? And so he came up with two quickly. He had them on the ready. And I'm bringing this first one up because you were talking about, there's this misconception of Stoicism or a Stoic being unemotional, whereas you were talking about that's different. That's not. You're talking about healthy emotions. So his first question is this. Let me just read it as he states it. As someone who regularly engages with other folks on Stoicism pages and forums, I think one of the most basic issues that frequently comes up and starts fights is to differentiate between true Stoicism and popular misconceptions about it. That is, many people, even those who are claiming to be Stoics, believe that Stoicism is about being emotionless, when that's not really the point. So, yeah, I guess you sort of talked about that, but yeah, is there...
Well, yes, there is this issue, but it's not. I don't think it's confined to Stoicism. I mean, right? There are. I grew up Catholic, and there's literally thousands of years of bloody conflicts within Catholicism, within Christianity, about who is a real Christian, who is not a real Christian.
Right.
And these people actually
Still
kill.
exist.
I mean, at least the Stoics have these animated discussions on Facebook, but the Christians actually literally killed themselves over this kind of stuff. So it's like, and I assume there are disputes like that within Buddhism, especially between different schools, right? So there's always an issue of who is in the club and who is outside of the club, and to a large extent, it doesn't matter. To me, you are a Stoic if you are inspired by the Stoic tradition, if you think that there is something valuable in the Stoic texts. That's enough to make you a Stoic. Now, that said, it is an interesting philosophical question. Are there some tenets within Stoicism, just like there are some tenets, let's say, within Christianity or Buddhism, that if you abandon them, if you let them go, then it's kind of hard to... Yeah, exactly. It's kind of hard to imagine that you could defend. For instance, I'm having a hard time thinking of somebody who says, I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in Jesus' resurrection. Because that's kind of the whole point of Christianity.
The key component.
Yeah, it's kind of a key component. You can argue about a bunch of other things and still, within the tradition, and still reasonably call yourself a Christian. But if you say, no, Christ was not the Son of God, it did not come to redeem our sins and did not resurrect after dying on the cross, like, okay, well then I think you're out of the game.
You're something else, right?
Right. Now, what would be the something like that in Stoicism? I think the notion that virtue is the only good, is the only true good, that is really a fundamental Stoic notion, which, by the way, the Stoics actually shared with their close cousins, the Cynics.
Hmm.
Cynics were those people that went around, having sex in the streets and reminding people that they were all unvirtuous, that sort of. So the Cynics were kind of in-your-face Stoics, essentially.
I definitely want to get to virtues in a moment. The big four: wisdom,
Yes.
moderation, justice, and courage.
Right.
But let me get to his second question. I actually think
Yes.
it's even a little more interesting. He says, and again, I'm going to quote him so that I don't get anything wrong here. I'd be very interested to hear your take on how a Stoic can relate and empathize with decidedly non-Stoic people.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, one of my biggest struggles as a husband and a father is dealing with high emotional affectation,
Mm-hmm.
Unnatural, insincere behavior among my wife and daughters.
Yeah.
Besides not really understanding what all the hubbub is about, I tend to want to impart Stoic wisdom to them since it brings me so much contentment and peace. But
Right.
it can be very difficult, and I tend to get lots of accusations of, you just don't get it. So I guess this question is, as a Stoic, how do you deal with people who just don't see the world that way?
That is an excellent question. And actually, Epictetus, this second century Stoic that I mentioned a minute ago, has a direct answer to that question. There is a bit in Epictetus, I think it's in the Enchiridion, in the manual for a good life, where he says, if somebody is that you love, that you care for, is distraught, let's say, for instance, is grieving for a loved one who died, do not go and tell him, hey, this is all in your mind.
Right.
You should because that's not helpful.
No.
In fact, Epictetus says what you should do is to outwardly groan or grieve in the same way, in the way in which he expects you to do it. Because it's not about you, it's about him or her.
Right.
You're trying to help that person. But then Epictetus also adds, be sure, however, that you don't groan or grieve inside. Right? So, in other words, you tell yourself, look, my wife or my daughter are having an emotional experience. The last thing that they want to hear from me is that, hey, get over it because this is not rational.
Right.
That's not helpful. So, in fact, what I should do is to try to empathize with them outwardly. If they expect me to look distraught, I should look distraught within limits, of course.
Right. Within reason, right?
Within reason. But inwardly, I should keep reminding myself, it's like, they're actually mistaken. They're not responding in the best way possible to the situation. But I want to be helpful because I love them. Therefore, this is what I'm going to do. Now, this may sound like, okay, so you're telling me basically to fake it. Right? And yes, I am, because
that is what you're saying.
Because that's useful, right? So right. The goal here, what you have to ask yourself, what is your goal? Is your goal to be condescending toward your loved ones, to tell them something that they don't want to hear and they're not receptive to hear just because that makes you feel better or superior? Or is your goal to actually be helpful? If the goal is to be helpful, then you should behave in the way that it's helpful to them, not to you.
Yeah.
Now, that said, once you start doing this, what the modern author Bill Irvine calls practicing stealth stoicism, that is, you're not telling them that this is what you're doing. Right. But once you start doing this, hopefully they will, at some point start paying attention and say, hey, I noticed that you're much more calm than you were, that you don't get upset. What's going on here? At that point, when they ask, you can say, well, let me tell you, have you ever heard of Epictetus?
Right.
Right. So in other words, you certainly want, I completely understand the feeling of, hey, this is really great, works for me. I want it to work for other people. But you also have to understand that other people may not be ready. And that may sound like a condescending statement. I think it's just a statement of fact. Some people are not ready. Some people will never be ready for that sort of stuff.
Stoicism
impose it.
It's a philosophy, not a religion. I mean, there's no motivation to spread the good word of Stoicism to, convert anyone, right? Well, let's. I do want to go. I do want to talk about the difference, but I actually want to go to the virtues now since we brought them up. And here's my question about the four virtues. As I mentioned, the four principal virtues in Stoicism are wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. To me, three of these four speak for themselves. They are prima facie virtues: wisdom, justice, and moderation. But I would like to ask about the virtue of courage in
Yep.
Stoicism. What is it? And by that, I doubt it means to blindly, carelessly engage in combat. If Mike Tyson picks a fight with me, should I be courageous and do battle, or does the virtue of wisdom triumph here, and I should run away?
Right. Now, that's a good question. First of all, the first thing I think to point out here is that the Stoics, just like Socrates, believed in what is called the unity of the virtues. Even though they mentioned four different virtues, as you pointed out, and by the way, they actually mentioned sub virtues within each one of those four. So
Sure.
the full list is actually like 20 or 30. But those are the four big ones, the so-called cardinal virtues.
Right.
They actually think that these four virtues are all different aspects of one underlying thing, which we'll refer to as wisdom or virtue, broadly speaking. Okay. That means that they are deeply interconnected. You cannot be courageous, according to a Stoic, without being also just, for instance, which is why you're right. You shouldn't be rushing into a fight with Mike Tyson just for the hell of it, because that's not courage from a Stoic perspective. That may be bravery, it may be, you may be, or it may be foolishness,
Right.
but it's certainly not courage in the moral sense. Courage has an inherently moral component built into it. So this is the courage to do the right thing,
Hmm.
which is why it cannot be decoupled from justice, and in fact even from temperance, because the right thing, which is what you call self-control, because the right thing needs to be done also in the right measure. So let me give you an example, a specific example. Let's say that tomorrow I get back to work and I see my boss that is harassing a coworker, which he would never do. He's a nice guy. But let's say that I witnessed that. Then the question is, should I intervene, and how?
Right.
So the Stoic consults the four cardinal virtues as kind of a moral compass, right? So the first virtue is practical wisdom. And practical wisdom basically is the ability to navigate complex situations in the best way possible. And so practical wisdom tells me that, yes, I probably should intervene, but I need to be careful about how I intervene, because I want to help people. I don't want to make the situation worse.
Hmm.
Does it take courage? Well, yes, because to intervene on behalf of my coworker and trying to diffuse the situation, I might, by doing so, I might actually get on the wrong side of my boss, which means there may be repercussions down the road. So it takes courage. Is it the right thing to do? Is it just? Well, justice for the Stoic is treating other people with fairness, respect, and reciprocity. So I have to ask myself, would I like, if I were the one to be arrested, would I like somebody else to intervene? And the answer is yes. Well, if I like somebody to intervene on my behalf, then clearly I need to intervene on somebody else's behalf.
So there's an
And then what
element
about?
of, I'm sorry to cut you off, but
Yeah,
there's an element of golden rule here, like do unto
yeah.
others. Okay.
That's right. Exactly. It's a kind of a reciprocity issue. And then finally, there's temperance. Well, temperance tells me that I need to, at this point, I know that I have to intervene, but I have a range of options, right? So at one extreme, I can simply mutter something under my breath so that my boss doesn't actually hear me, right? So technically I intervened, but in reality, I didn't do anything. And so it's like, no, that's not good. At the opposite extreme, I might jump into this situation and start punching my boss on the nose, right? Like, but that's too much. That the situation doesn't require that. There is no physical threat there. There is only verbal abuse, and so reacting that way is too much. So temperance tells me that I want to chart a course in between those two extremes. So I want to come in with a firm voice, trying to diffuse the situation calmly as possible, but very clearly, so that I'm actually heard by both people. So the decision to intervene and how to intervene is the result of my quick consultation inside my mind with the four cardinal virtues, and they go in unison.
Mm,
If one of them tells me this is not a good thing to do, I probably shouldn't do it,
I
because
see.
that signals that there is something there that I should stay away from.
So Stoicism is a form of situation ethics. Are there? I mean, is it fair to say that? Are there any kind of absolutes at all? You know, a thou shalt not, so to speak, or is it all sort of
Very good
situation?
question. Very good question. I think not just Stoicism, but virtue ethics in general is situational.
Mm,
Now, situational doesn't mean that anything goes. It's not a license toward moral relativism. That, oh well, it's your opinion, my opinion. Who cares?
right.
That is not what situational means. Situational means literally it depends on the situation. So if the question is, what is the right thing to do, then the answer is always, well, it depends. It depends on what? It depends on who the actors are at play, what are they doing, what their motivations presumably are, and what the possible consequences of your actions are going to be. And so the same exact action for a Stoic may have different meanings. For instance, let's say that I decide to volunteer to the local soup kitchen, right?
Mm,
Now, you might say, well, that's a no-brainer. That's a clearly good thing to do. That's clearly a virtuous action. But for the Stoic, the question is, well, wait a minute. Why are you doing it? If I'm doing that because I genuinely want to help people, right, then yes, it is a virtuous action. But if I do it because I need a additional line on my resume that shows that I volunteered for nonprofit organizations so that I can get a better job, in other words, I don't actually give a crap about helping people,
right.
then it's not a virtuous action.
Right.
It's the
Right.
same exact action, but it's not virtuous.
Right. So your intention is important.
Correct. Intentions are crucial. And this goes back to the economy of control. Why is it that intentions as opposed to outcomes are crucial? Not because the outcomes don't matter. A lot of people, a lot of critics of Stoicism misunderstand this point and think that, oh, you don't care about the consequence. Of course I care about the consequence.
Yeah.
I want to help diffuse the situation with my boss and the person he's harassing. I want to be helpful to the people in the soup kitchen. However, outcomes are not under my control, because they depend on the actions of other people. They depend on external factors that I don't control. On the other hand, intentions definitely are under my control. And that's why there is a focus on intentions and not on outcomes.
Okay. Let me ask you something about things that we can't control. When I was thinking about this in preparation for our talk, I thought about things that are beyond my control that I care about, like sports. Should I not care about sports because it's beyond my control?
That's a great question. The Stoics actually do say, don't, you shouldn't care. Both
That's a
Marcus
tough sell
Aurelius,
right there.
I know, right? Both Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus say, if you have to, just go to the stadium, go to the Circus Maximus in the case of Marcus Aurelius, but don't care whether the green team wins or the white teams. It's like whatever team wins. It's outside of your control.
I was
Now,
afraid you were going to say that. Go
yeah,
ahead.
well, that's that. I'm a big soccer fan, for instance, AS Roma supporter.
Hmm.
And so how do I reconcile that with the Stoic attitude? I actually use I watch occasionally soccer games, and I approach the soccer game with the Stoic attitude in this particular, with this twist. Not that I don't care. I do prefer my team to win.
Right.
But at the beginning of the game, I tell myself, look, the outcome is entirely outside of your control. And it is the combination of who the best team is and luck. Because as we all know in sports, sure, typically the best
ball
team
bounces
wins.
a way that you can't predict sometimes, right?
Exactly. The Italians say la palla è rotonda, the ball is round, which means that it can bounce all over the place and you don't control it, right? And so then it becomes an exercise in just how well can I handle disappointment, right? So if my team loses, it's like, oh, well, I tell myself, well, they didn't play well, or this time they were not lucky.
Right.
Contrary-wise, if they win, I don't just go all over and say, we are still better than much everybody else. I say, well, this time they played well, they were the better team, or this time they got lucky. And you turn a activity of watching sports into an exercise, basically.
Yeah, and I have experienced similar. Uh, I would say like a narrowing window of my emotions when it comes
Yeah,
to sports now. So, yeah, the lows aren't quite as low when my team loses, but the highs aren't as high either. I'm not, it's just. I mean, it's still great. I want my team to
yeah,
win, and then when it
yeah,
does, it's
exactly.
fun. But I'm not going crazy over it, And
Exactly. And the typical answer that I get in these situations is like, but aren't you losing something by narrowing, as you put it, that's exactly right. You narrow the emotional spectrum.
mm,
You cut out the very low parts, but you also cut out the very high parts.
right.
And my response in the case specifically of sports is like, you think that I should act like those crazy people who think that it's really a big deal if their team loses or wins, and who occasionally become so upset about it that they become actually violent toward other
Right.
people, supporters. I don't think so.
Yeah.
If that's the kind of extreme, high that you're talking, or low that you're talking about, no, thank you. I'd rather not.
Yeah, I'm with you there because like when I was a kid, I, I grew up in Alabama. I went to the University of Alabama as an undergrad, and so you might be aware that they're pretty good at football. And so, like,
Yep.
when I was a kid, we would play Auburn, our rival.
And by
And
football, of course, you mean American football.
yes, not soccer. I'm sorry. You live in America. You know what
Yep.
I mean. I have to deal with that all the time. I live in Japan, so like the other English speakers here are from England and Australia, and so
Exactly.
I have to always watch my vernacular. But I would like cry if Alabama lost to
Right.
Auburn. But now it's like, it's just a game. What's for dinner? I just leave it
Exactly.
alone. Um,
Exactly. Now it becomes really difficult, however, when you apply that to more important things in life, right?
mm,
So the Stoics will also say, yeah, that's the right attitude, and you should apply that attitude also when a loved one dies. It's like,
mm,
well, it's the universe, things, shit happens. It's like
right.
that is where a lot of people have trouble. Epictetus at one point says, when you kiss your wife or your daughter goodnight, remember that they're mortals and they might die. You might never see them again. And if you do that, then you will not be disturbed, he says, if they actually do that. And he's like, wait a minute, what do you mean I shouldn't be disturbed
Right.
if my loved ones die? Is this guy a psychopath or something like that? But he's not. He's coming from the point of view of Stoic metaphysics as it was understood 2,000 years ago.
Mm,
And that is actually one of the things that I reject in modern Stoicism. So the ancient Stoics thought that the universe is a living organism endowed with what they call the logos, that is, an ability to act rationally.
right.
If that's true, then by definition, we are bits and pieces of the universal organism. We're like cells
Mm,
inside this gigantic organism. And therefore, whatever happens to us is for the good of the organism. We're helping the organism doing things, even though it may be unpleasant for us.
mm,
Epictetus uses an interesting metaphor. He says, imagine you're a foot that is about to step into the mud. If you think of that situation only as a foot, you'd say, I don't want to step in the mud. That's disgusting. Why would I want to do that?
right.
But then you remember that you're not just a foot. You are connected to a whole organism, to a body. And the body needs to get home. And the only way to get home is for you to step into the mud. At that point, not only you do it because it's your duty as a foot, you actually embrace it because
Mm,
you're doing the right thing for the entire organism, right? Now, that's a beautiful thought. And that's
mm,
where that's the source, that metaphysical understanding of how the world works is the source of Stoic providence. That is why Epictetus says, you shouldn't be distraught if your loved ones are dying, because whatever happens is for the good of the universe.
mm.
Well, that's great. I wish I could believe that. But I don't. I'm a scientist in the 21st century. I don't believe for a minute that the universe is a living organism endowed with logos. We are not we are bits and pieces of the universe in a general sense.
Right.
Because, yes, of course, we're within the universe, but we're not organically connected to the full body in the way that the Stoics thought.
Mm,
Therefore, if my wife or daughter should die, or one day they will die, assuming that I'm going to be around to see it, then I cannot afford not to be distraught.
mm,
But I can still tell myself, this is what happens. We all mortals, and we need to be prepared to die. So I don't have the luxury that Epictetus had of being actually embracing my fate, but I certainly still have the option to accept my fate and try to move on, because it is a natural, normal thing. People die. I will
Well,
die at some point.
well, that's a perfect segue to one of the last questions I wanted to ask you. Is that you're talking about if a loved one dies, in that New York Times article I mentioned at the in the introduction, you state that Stoicism speaks directly to a lifelong preoccupation of yours
Right.
and of mine and of, I dare say, most people, and that is the inevitability of our own demise, our own death, and how to prepare for it. So here's my question: how do I prepare for
it? Two ways. You do two things. First of all, you occasionally meditate, reflect, remind yourself that you are mortal and it will happen. In other words, we need to take seriously this thing. A lot of people just take it out of their minds.
Right.
I don't want to think about death. I don't want to be exposed to death. I don't want to. No. On the contrary, the Stoics would say you need to face not only your own mortality but other people's mortality. So when some of your, let's say your parents or your grandparents end up in the hospital or in the hospice, and then they die, you really should be there, and you should be paying attention, and you should remind yourself consciously, this is likely what's going to happen to me. Mm-hmm. Now, this may not be fun, but what it does is it prepares you mentally for when that's going to happen. That's one thing. But that's only once in a while. Only occasionally you do that sort of thing. Most of the other time, you remind yourself that, hey, I am mortal. That means I don't have an infinite amount of time. So how am I spending my time today? What am I doing that I actually enjoy, I actually think it's meaningful, that I actually think makes a difference? And what am I doing, by contrast, that I don't think it's meaningful, it's a waste of time, and therefore I probably shouldn't do it, right? So there is a lot of research actually in modern psychology about people dying or people at the end of their life, and about what is it they regret and what is it that they actually are satisfied about their life. And I guarantee you, nobody regrets not having spent more time on Facebook.
You got that right.
Right? Or more time in a meeting at the office. Or it's like, damn, imagine yourself on the deathbed and say,
Man,
I really should.
I can't believe I didn't send that tweet.
Yeah, I right. What do people regret? Mostly relationships, not having been good enough or close enough to their children, to their spouse, to their partner, to their parents, and so on and so forth, as well as not having spent enough of their time during their life doing things that are meaningful to them. Like the two of us are doing right now, right? I mean, we could be doing all sorts of other things, right? And yet we are talking to each other. Why? Well, I don't know about you, because I can't read your mind and your motivations, but in my mind, that's because I think people might actually benefit from this conversation, and doing something that benefits other people, and at the same time is interesting to me, because I'm genuinely interested, of course, in this, in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. This is great. This is the way I want to spend my time.
My wife actually said something. This was a few months ago, but it's stuck in my head, and it's along these lines. She said, I don't remember any of the stuff I ever bought, and I was thinking that made me think oh yeah, like a long time ago, I remember I was kind of excited when I bought a BlackBerry, those phones that nobody has anymore. But I have not even thought about it since then. And then she said, I don't remember the stuff I bought, but I remember the places I've traveled to, and I remember the relationships I've had, exactly. and it just really kind of highlighted me, that's the important stuff in life is experience, is relationships and interactions. And exactly. You said in one of your talks that one of the things that how humans are distinct from other animals is one, our capacity to be rational, and the other was that we're highly social. There are other social animals in the animal kingdom, but we are by far the most complex and social of all the animals that exist.
Exactly. Which is why the Stoics' motto is, or mantra, is live according to nature. And by that, they meant those two things combined.
Hmm.
Human nature is distinguished primarily by the fact that we are capable of reason. That doesn't mean we're reasonable all the time or even
Right.
most of the time, but
Right.
we are capable of high degrees of highly sophisticated degrees of reasoning. And we are highly social. I mean, there are other animals capable of reasoning, and there are other animals that are social. But the two are combined in human beings. The two are combined to an extent that is found nowhere else on the planet.
Right.
And so the Stoics thought that's human nature, and therefore a good human life is one in which you use reason, you use that ability to solve problems for doing what? For improving society,
Hmm.
for making life better for other people. And improving society, sounds like a big task. Like, well, who am I? I'm not the president of the United States. I'm not going to be able to improve society. But yes, you can, because you improve society by relating to other people, the people you love, your friends, your colleagues, your wife, as I said, your children. That's how you improve society. Imagine if everybody were mindfully trying to treat better the people that they know. Then this would be a far better place than it is.
Yeah, I've said that before on the program. Like, when I talk about changing the world, I don't mean like you have to go be Gandhi or Mother Teresa.
Right.
I'm change your world. Do something nice for your coworker or your spouse or family member or your friend or whatever. Change your world, and that it's a ripple effect. It changes the world.
Yes.
Well, professors, thank you so much. What do you have going on now? Like, where can people find you? Are you on social media? Where can they buy your books? What's your latest book?
Yeah, I'm all over the place, but the best place to find me is a site called philosophyasawayoflife.blog.
Okay.
And there you will find links to my social media. I'm on Twitter and Facebook, to my books, to my articles, my podcasts, everything. In terms of books, the latest one that came out recently last year is called Think Like a Stoic, Ancient Wisdom for Today's World. And it's actually not really a book. It's a series of lectures that I prepared for the teaching company, but it is distributed by Audible as an audiobook. And so that people might want to check that one out. It's a complete course on the history, philosophy, and practice of Stoicism.
Nice.
And then hopefully by September, there will be, my new book will come out. It's called The Quest for Character: What the Story of Socrates and Alcibiades Teaches Us About Our Search for Good Leaders. And it's about leadership. It's about the interaction between politics and ethics. And I had a lot of fun writing it. So I'm hoping that people will enjoy it.
Well, I've had a lot of fun discussing this with you today. It's been a blast. I'll send this out with a quote. I'll quote you. This is also from that New York Times article. In the end, Stoicism is simply another path some people can try out in order to develop a more or less coherent view of the world, of who they are, and of how they fit in the broader scheme of things. The need for this sort of insight seems to be universal. Indeed, it is a universal pursuit, and I appreciate you helping us get there today, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.